أهلا بكم. حلقتنا اليوم حلقة مهمة حاورنا فيها امرأة غيرت شكل المشهد السياسي في ليبيا. في ناس شافوا أنها هي غيرت المشهد السياسي سلبا، وفي ناس شافوا أنها هي غيرت المشهد السياسي إيجابا. في ناس يشوفوا فيها هي صورة ناعمة للسياسات الأمريكية الصلبة، وفي ناس يشوفوا فيها هي أنها امرأة حديدية وقوية واستطاعت أن تلعب على تناقضات المشهد السياسي في ليبيا. سألناها عن كيف يفكر صانع القرار الليبي، كيف استطاعت أن تروض التناقضات الداخلية والخارجية في لحظة حوار جنيف، وسألناها أيضا عن كيف أنتجت سلطة تنفيذية ولماذا فشلت الانتخابات، وعن عقدة القوة القاهرة والثلاثي السياسي في ليبيا حفتر دبيبة سيف ودخولهم للعملية الانتخابية. حاورناها ليس من باب السياسة، ولكن حاورناها من باب التاريخ، لأنها غادرت المشهد السياسي كليا. أتمنى أن تكون حلقة مهمة وأن تجدوا فيها كلام يسمع لأول مرة. أهلا وسهلا بك سيدة ستيفاني.
شكرا جزيلا على هذه الفرصة أستاذ ياسين. أنا مبسوطة جدا أن أكون معكم ومع المشاهدين الكرام.
احنا سعداء أيضا بأن يتجدد عودتك إلى المشهد الليبي عبر بودكاست الأحرار، ونتمنى أن نقدم نقاش مهم يفيد الليبيين ويجعلهم يفهموا كيف يفكر الساسة الليبيين وكيف يفكر أصحاب المصلحة الدوليين والإقليميين في ليبيا. بس قبل ما نبدأ في سخونة الملف، خلينا نبدأ من البدايات. أول علاقتك بالعرب حسب بحثي كانت في جامعة جورج تاون، في مركز الدراسات العربية في جامعة جورج تاون. كيف كنت تتصور العرب قبل أن تعرفيهم؟ يعني كيف عرفتي العرب من الكتب قبل أن تشوفيهم وتتعرفي عليهم كأشخاص وكمجتمعات؟
Well, I think I need to start before I went to Georgetown because it was when I was living in Jordan as a teenager that I first heard the Arabic language. And I decided really at that moment that I wanted to learn Arabic and that I wanted to work and live in the Arab world. And so that sort of began my path to my studies at Georgetown, and then directly from there to living first in the Gulf, in Bahrain. And from there, I worked in the private sector in Bahrain, and then I joined the U.S. government. I first went to Pakistan. And then to Kuwait. I also lived in the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi, where I had my 2 children. Then I moved to Jordan. I also spent, of course, time in Washington. All of this with the U.S. diplomatic service, focusing on the region, on the Middle East and North Africa region. I served in Iraq, and then I also served and worked on the Syria file. Then I was asked to lead the U.S. Embassy to Libya, but based in Tunisia. That was in the beginning of 2018. And then I decided to leave the U.S. government to take an early retirement, and I joined the United Nations in July of 2018 and went directly into Libya, where I stayed, as you know, on and off for about 4 years until 2022.
أنت تقريبا اختصرتي يعني رحلة 20 سنة أو أكثر، 25 سنة في دقيقتين، ولكن يهمني الانطباعات، يعني يهمني ما قبل وما بعد. كيف كانت ستيفاني ويليامز يعني تتخيل العرب كمجتمعات، كمخيال سياسي، كقدرة سياسية، وكيف وجدت العرب كصناع قرار وكفعل سياسي وقدرة على الفعل والحركة السياسية.
Look, I don't think I should generalize. There are, you know, hundreds of millions of people in the Arab world, 20 plus countries. Each country has its own special characteristics. I really enjoyed when I was first introduced to the region and working in Bahrain. I worked for a local company that was also very international. So I worked with Bahrainis, Lebanese, with people from all over the world. And I think that is also a great characteristic of the region, is that it's a crossroads. You know, when I served in Iraq, it was very difficult circumstances because the country was in the middle of a terrible war against Daesh. And I came to really admire the Iraqi people who were trying to save their country. When I lived in Jordan, I also became a great admirer of the Jordanian people and their hospitality, because their country has become the home to so many refugees in the region. And when I was living in Jordan, that's when a number of Syrians were coming, fleeing the war in their country. But of course, you know, I think the country that has the special place in my heart is Libya, because I spent the most time in Libya and I got to know Libyans from all walks of life. And I have a great deal of affection and also admiration for the people of Libya.
يعني أثناء نقاشنا اكتشفت أنك أنت زرتي ليبيا قبل يعني 2011 وقبل ثورة فبراير، ولكن أظن لا أحد يعرف هذه الزيارات. في أي ظروف جاءت زياراتك لليبيا أيام القذافي؟
Well, I do mention this in my book. So I worked on the Libya file from the policy office, the North Africa policy office in Washington, D.C. And this was between the years 2007 to 2008. It was after the United States had returned the embassy to Libya, reopened the embassy, sent diplomats back. There was a lot of engagement with the Gaddafi regime. There was investment that was coming into the country. It was also the period where we decided to send our ambassador. So the United States went for several decades, if not more, without an ambassador to Libya. So I was the head of the office that managed his return, the return of the ambassador. Also, the first visit by the U.S. Secretary of State, Secretary Condoleezza Rice, visited Tripoli at that time. So, and that was also during the final settlement of the Lockerbie case. And those decisions were all interrelated. And so as the head of the office, I did visit Libya twice, just to Tripoli. They were very short visits. I would 2 or 3 days each visit to consult with the embassy, but also I went to the foreign ministry. I met with some Libyans, but it was a very, very different Libya than the Libya that I returned to in 2018. One of the main differences was that during the Gaddafi period, people were really afraid to speak to us about what was happening in the country. There was a great deal of silence and fear.
في تلك الفترة يعني التقيت كده بمسؤولين ليبيين. ما يعني أي مخاوف كانت تجاه العلاقة الأمريكية، لأنك في تلك اللحظة كنت دبلوماسية أمريكية. ما هي المخاوف اللي كان يحملها نظام القذافي تجاه الأمريكان وما هي الفرص التي كان يبحث عنها لبناء علاقة جديدة مع أمريكا بعد لو كوربي، وبعد المشكلة اللي كانت أيام ريغن والمشاكل القديمة.
Well, I can't speak for like any fears that, you know, people in the regime or concerns that they may have had about reestablishing the relationship with the United States. What I will say is that they seem to be quite eager. There was a lot of readiness to engage with the United States at the time. The relationship was still quite tense. Mostly because of the focus of the United States on the human rights situation in Libya and the focus on particular cases. For instance, and I speak about this also in my book, one of the big cases that we worked on was Fatih al-Jahmi, who was a political dissident in Libya and who passed away in a hospital in Jordan after many years and suffering, you know, many years in prison where his health deteriorated. So we would work on cases like that. And certainly the regime was not interested really in talking to the American government about the human rights situation. The other major file at that time was what we call the counterterrorism file, because of the focus from Washington after 9/11 on the whole counterterrorism story. So that, took quite a priority, I would say, in the bilateral relationship.
في الفترة اللي أنت زرتي فيها ليبيا كان مشروع سيف الإسلام القذافي. هل كان في أي علاقة بشكل أو بآخر مع الوجه الجديد لنظام القذافي اللي هو كان يمثل سيف الإسلام القذافي، الوجه الليبرالي الذي كان يقدم؟ هل كان في تواصل مثلا مع سيف، أم أن المسألة كانت محصورة عند النظام والقذافي وأجهزته يعني؟
Well, I think as the U.S. government, of course, there was engagement, with all of these individuals. But during my period as the head of the policy office for Libya, we had a visit from Mu'tasim Gaddafi. It was an official visit to Washington in the year 2009 in his capacity as the National Security Advisor, and he met with Secretary Hillary Clinton at that time. Also, around that time, Saif al-Islam visited Washington, but it was in a private capacity. He spoke at a think tank. And as you know, during that period, there was a competition between the two sons. For Saif, it was more of a public relations trip. For Mu'tasim Gaddafi, it was an official visit. Yes.
ربما كثير من الناس يعني يشبهون تنافس بين الأبناء بما يحدث اليوم أيضا في عائلة حفتر. هناك تنافس يشبه هذا التنافس.
I think that's probably accurate. Yes, you can somehow see that there's another family competition underway.
فيما يتعلق ب يعني أنت ذكرتي أنك وصلتي إلى ليبيا لتهيئة الأجواء لعودة السفارة. وفي تلك الفترة كان كريس ستيفنز اللي هو يعني عند الليبيين يحمل مكانة خاصة، باعتبار أن الحادثة التي مر بها في نظر كثيرين أن هي كانت السبب في تغير سياسة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. في البداية هل التقيتي بالسيد كريس ستيفنز، وماذا تذكرين من لقاءاتك وانطباعاتك عنه وعن لقاءاتك فيه؟
So yes, Chris was the chargé d'affaires in Libya during the period that I was the head of the policy office. And then he became the deputy chief of mission when the ambassador, who was Jean Kretz, arrived in Tripoli, also during this period. Chris was a very special individual. I remember meeting with him when I visited Tripoli. It was clear even then, and this is before the revolution, that Tripoli and Libya had a very, very special place in his heart, and he was working very, very hard on behalf of the relationship between the people of the United States and the people of Libya. On that terrible day when he was killed in Benghazi along with 3 other colleagues, I was actually serving in Bahrain on the other side of the Arab world. And I can tell you that so many of us, our hearts just broke that day because of the loss of such an incredible person, leader, and someone who poured everything that he had into this new Libya, which emerged in 2011. I think that you are partially right that the United States, the Obama administration, took a hard look after the assassination of Chris and the other colleagues at really the direction of policy in the Middle East, because it was clear that the optimism of the Arab Spring was already really beginning to decrease, and the president, and to a certain degree, people around the President Obama, had always been very hesitant about the kind of regime change policy that President Bush had pursued in Iraq. And in fact, President Obama, when he was a senator, was very against. And when he was a politician before that, he was against the invasion of Iraq. And so as Chris's death and the whole scandal that surrounded what happened in Benghazi on that terrible day became a domestic political issue as well in the United States, with the Congress really focusing on what happened, and it became a political football. Again, I think Libya became a toxic issue for American politicians.
أنت يعني ذكرتي إن في تغير صار في بعد حادث كريس ستيفنز في 2012، إن صار تغير في السياسة الأمريكية. أنا سؤال: هل التغير كان يعني بمعنى تحول الملف من اليو اس ديبارتمنت من الخارجية إلى CIA مثلا، أو تحول مثلا إلى البنتاغون؟ ما هي طبيعة هذا التحول في الملف؟
Well, I think there are two parts to this answer that I will give you. One is, of course, in Libya itself, the situation began to deteriorate, especially moving into 2013 and then into 2014, when you had the first civil war after the fall of the regime took place in 2014, and the violence really kicked off, and the fracturing and fragmentation of Libya became more and more of an issue, right? And the U.S. Embassy, we had an ambassador, Deborah Jones, who I knew and I still know very well. She served as the ambassador. She had to evacuate the embassy. So yes, you had a sort of withdrawal of the United States, and many other countries had to leave Libya at that time. Now, the other factor here, the other part to the answer is that let's be clear that after Gaddafi was overthrown, many Libyans said, we will take care of our country now. We will make the decisions This will be a Libyan-owned process, which is very understandable, and we support that. The UN mission was created in 2011 to support the new Libyan authorities. But as became clear within a couple of years, Libyan politicians were adopting this zero-sum approach to politics, and they weren't interested in striking compromises and working together. And that also that accelerated the deterioration of the situation, along with the fact that there was no disarmament that took place after Gaddafi's fall. So you had all of these, groups with their weapons, and frankly, if you have a weapon and there's nobody to stop you, you're going to use that weapon. So all of these developments combined, I think, to, create a certain distance, speaking in terms of the policy from the United States, and then the reliance on the United Nations, on the United Nations political mission to mediate and to negotiate amongst the Libyans to stop conflict and help them towards a solution. And that's where you saw the initial mandate of the UN political mission in 2011 was to support the Libyan institutions, and particularly to help Libyans achieve the first elections, which were a great success in 2012. And it was the UN electoral office that was really key in helping with the higher national elections commission in Libya. But once the conflict started in 2014, the mandate of the UN mission shifted to mediation. And that's where we start with the Libyan political agreement that was signed in the end of December 2015.
اوكي. يعني كان السؤال عن تغير السياسة الأمريكية، تغيرت في اتجاه أمني، يعني في اتجاه عسكري أكثر، أم تغيرت اتجاه انسحاب؟ لأن هناك من يفسر أن مثلا تحركات حفتر في 2014 هي كانت مدفوعة بعلاقات قديمة مع CIA، وأنت الآن قريبة من هذه الدوائر، يعني يمكن أن تثبتي ذلك أو تنفيه فكرة أنه هو كان في رغبة أمريكية لإنهاء هذه المجموعات أو بعض المجموعات التي ساهمت بشكل أو بآخر في قضية السفير كريس ستيفنز، حتى لو هذا كان على حساب يعني تطلعات الشعب أو على حساب تطلعات فبراير في تلك اللحظة. هذا يعني تفسير رائج موجود في الشارع السياسي الليبي. إلى أي حد في وجهة نظرك أن هذا متسق مع الأوضاع التي صنعت في ليبيا بعد 2014؟
So there's the story of Mr. Haftar and his project in Libya. And there's the story of U.S. policy towards Libya. And sometimes they intersect and sometimes they don't. So as I noted early in our conversation, that counterterrorism was a policy priority for the U.S. government during the Gaddafi regime. It remained a priority when the new authorities in Libya took over in 2011. It became a particular priority, yes, to apprehend and hold to account the people who were responsible for the killing of the U.S. ambassador and his colleagues in Benghazi. At the same time, because the situation in Libya had deteriorated and the borders were not protected, you had then the emergence of Daesh and Al-Qaeda in Libya. And in 2016, the U.S. and the UK cooperated with individuals, with groups in Misrata. Yes, Bunyan al-Marsus, and with the authorities in Tripoli to remove the Daesh threat, particularly in Sirte. So, yes, there is a counterterrorism story that I believe. I don't speak for the U.S. government now. I'm not in touch with the U.S. government now, but I imagine that counterterrorism is still a top priority for the United States in Libya. Now, then there's the Mr. Haftar story. And yes, his relationships, how he made it to the United States, his relationship with the CIA. Again, I've mentioned that in my book. But he is also a creature. First of all, he's a Libyan who returned to his country. He gathered the remnants of Mr. Gaddafi's forces, brought other militias in, and he launched his project. And the counterterrorism sort of relationship with Mr. Gaddafi has been there. I mean, with Mr. Haftar has been there and continues to be there. That doesn't mean that there's not a relationship with other authorities in Libya, as there has been. And the goal of the UN when I was there and working for the UN, I think the goal of many countries has been to really seek a unification of the Libyan military, of the Libyan security forces, because that, above all, will help protect Libyans and build professionalism that wasn't. Let's face it, Mr. Gaddafi's army there wasn't really much of a military, right? Because it had become different militias run by the Sun, the Katab run by the Sons. It wasn't professional, and so this is a project which we focused on at great length in the Joint Military Commission that we established in 2020, and that still operates today in trying to nurture the relationships between the Chief of Staff in the West and the Chief of Staff in Eastern Libya. And I should say that it was very, very sad to learn of the premature death of General Haddad and General Fatori Ghrabil, both of whom and all the other people who died on that terrible plane crash in December. And so I got to know General Haddad and General Ghrabil, in the course of my duties in Libya. And the fight, yes, General Fatori was a member of the Western delegation to the 5+5. So to cultivate, those relationships between the Eastern and Western military leaders, that's really the way forward. If I could just talking about the focus on counterterrorism. And again, I mention this in the book as a theme of sometimes the difficulty that the UN mission faced, which was that the major countries tended to look at Libya through the lens of one policy priority. Let's say for the US, maybe for France, for the UK, it's counterterrorism. For Italy, it's counter-migration. Now, the United Nations is tasked with institution and state building. There is an inherent contradiction. There's a contradiction between these different policy priorities. Because if you have a short-term policy priority, which is either counterterrorism or counter-migration, you're going to work with groups, armed groups, militias, who aren't interested in state building. They're interested in the business that they're involved in. And so we always, in the United Nations, came up against this. There has to be a medium to long-term perspective on what's required in Libya, which is that because of the destruction of the state.
ذكرتيني هنا وانت تحدث عن حفتر بما ذكرتيه في الكتاب على رشاش تست. كيف ينظر كيف تنظر أطراف مختلفة إلى حفتر من زاوية مختلفة.
From different angles. But the priority has to be on, I believe, on the very necessary state and institution building project in Libya. Because you had decades of state deconstruction, destroying the state. You have to build the state back up so it's capable and able to meet all of these challenges.
أوكي. في بس أنت يعني لما تحدثنا عن حفتر وعلاقته بالولايات المتحدة الأمريكية قلتي إن يعني ليس مشروع أمريكي ولكن التقى في هدف أمريكي مع مشروع حفتر. يعني في أهداف أمريكية التقت مع مشروع حفتر ولكن ليس مشروعا أمريكيا من الأساس. أو يعني هيك فهمت منك. هل فهمي صحيح يعني؟
Yes, in the sense of, look, I mean, it's no secret that Mr. Haftar, particularly in the immediate years leading up to his attack on Tripoli in 2019, his foreign sponsors were other countries, right? And so, yes, of course, the United States, and the United Nations he's a major actor in Libya, had contact with him. And that's to be expected.
أوكي. طيب احنا الآن ما زلنا في 2014 بعدين وهذا كله نحن نحكي كدبلوماسية أمريكية ترى المشهد من وجهة نظر أمريكية. في 2017 عدتي مرة ثانية إلى ليبيا لأول مرة طبعا بعد زيارة القذافي. عدتي كقائمة بالأعمال، قائمة بالأعمال السفارة الأمريكية. يعني أي هدف كان موضوع على طاولة الخارجية الأمريكية لتنفيذه من قبل ستيفاني ويليامز؟ ما هو الهدف الرئيسي الذي طلب من ستيفاني ويليامز في أن تقوم به في ليبيا كدبلوماسية أمريكية؟
Yes, so that was in January 2018 when I returned to Libya as the chargé d'affaires of the U.S. Embassy, but we were based in Tunis. We were not based in the U.S. Embassy. Still, to my knowledge, has not returned physically to Libya. It's still based in Tunis. It was called the Libya External Office. So, look, our primary priority was to support the UN mediation efforts and to work with the government of national accord with Prime Minister, was then Prime Minister Siraj and his government to provide any sort of support in terms of the assistance and needs of that government. So our political weight, however, was on really showing as much support as possible to the efforts of the UN mediator. At that time, it was Hassan Salameh. And he had just, like in 2017, fall of 2017, he had launched his action plan, which was to amend the Libyan political agreement.
في تلك اللحظة في كثير كانوا يروا أن اليون البعثة الأممية كانت هي حديقة خلفية للدبلوماسية الأمريكية. وهذا نتج عنه أنك أنت يعني تحولتي من قائمة بأعمال السفارة الأمريكية إلى نائبة مبعوث أممي. حتى أن بعض الناس أذكر يعني من بعض السياسيين قال أن غسان سلامة هو العقل وستيفاني ويليامز العضلات، مع تقديرنا لجهدك، ولكن الجنسية كانت تلعب دور كبير في في فكرة دعم المبعوث الأممي. يعني لو كانت ستيفاني ويليامز ليست أمريكية لم تكن لتحظى بذلك الدعم.
I can certainly understand why Libyans would perhaps think that. But yes, because it's a bit unusual that I went from being the chargé to being the deputy to Hassan Salama, 6 months later. But let's make it really clear. I had decided really in 2017 that I was going to take an early retirement from the U.S. government, from the U.S. Foreign Service. And you might ask why, because by that point I was the deputy chief of mission at the largest U.S. embassy in the world, which was in Baghdad. I could have, written my future in the U.S. government, but this was right after Mr. Trump had taken office in his first term as the president, and he. While we were sitting in Baghdad, working with the Iraqi government and the Iraqi armed forces to prepare for the major battle to push Daesh out of Mosul. We were also, by the way, working very closely with the United Nations mission. Mr. Trump decides to announce this prohibition, this ban on citizens of mostly Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, to come to the United States. And Iraq was on the list. And I guess are they back on the list now? Yeah, I guess they're back on the list now. So this was a very offensive and bad and racist and chauvinist decision. Discriminatory decision. And at that point I said, look, this is just the beginning of this 4 years. And I don't think that I can represent this government.
يعني كان موقف مبدئي، موقف أخلاقي أكثر من كونه موقف سياسي.
Yeah, I decided that I couldn't look myself in the mirror. So I had decided, and when the State Department asked me to come to Tunis to handle the Libya file, I said yes, but I will only be there for 6 months because I'm leaving. I'm retiring. I'm going to go back to my family. And then at the same time, I met Dr. Salama, who was the UN envoy. And he encouraged me to apply for a job, a position in the United Nations. And there was this new position that had been created in Libya for the United Nations as the Deputy Special Representative for Political Affairs. And so I applied. And they accepted me. And I joined the UN in July of 2018. But I left the U.S. government. I had contact with, as in my capacity as a UN official. Of course, I had contact with the State Department and former colleagues. But I had completely cut all of my ties with the U.S. government.
لما قدمتي على نائبة المبعوثة الأممية قدمتي بدعم من السيد غسان سلامة. كان واضح أن في كيمياء بينك وبين السيد غسان سلامة حتى وأنت في السفارة الأمريكية. هذا صحيح؟
He encouraged me to apply for the job, but I was appointed by the Secretary General.
بس بدعم.
It's always, those are New York decisions. Those are not decisions taken by the envoys in the field.
طيب انتقلتي من السفارة الأمريكية، تجربة لم تكن طويلة، يعني من السفارة الأمريكية كانت تجربة قصيرة جدا، إلى البعثة الأممية. وهنا صنعت ستيفاني ويليامز في عيون الليبيين. يعني الليبيين شافوا هذه المرأة الشقراء التي جاءت إلى ليبيا. في الأول يعني كانت ظل السيد غسان سلامة، ثم صنعت نفسها دور يعني منفصل. في البداية ما هو الهدف الذي كان مطلوب منك أن تلعبيه مع السيد غسان سلامة، أو ما هو الدور الذي كان مصنوع السيدة ستيفاني، لأن هذه المهمة صنعت خصيصا تقريبا لحضرتك.
That's a very good question. So first of all, I was there to support the UN envoy who had already launched this action plan with the three parts to the action plan. One was he had already started the talks between the two chambers in the fall of 2017 to amend the Libyan political agreement. But as we know, those talks didn't go anywhere. Right. Then also to work on preparing a referendum for the Constitution, and that didn't go anywhere because of the stubbornness of the politicians. And then really the intensive preparations for what would have been the national conference. So, I worked really hand in glove with Dr. Salama at the time. Through the Geneva-based Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, there was a whole preparatory process for the national conference that had taken place with like 77 meetings all over Libya and abroad with the diaspora, where like 7,000 Libyans were contacted and a report was generated. And based on that, we designed, the national conference. We also put a great emphasis on the economic file because
تقريبا كان هذا يحدث لأول مرة أن يدخل الاقتصاد في المحادثات السياسية.
To mainstreaming it into negotiations, yes. Making sure that it had an equal place you had a political track, an economic track, and a military track. But we had to build that economic base of knowledge within the mission itself. And so that came under my office, and we had several people working, and we started our contacts with all of the different sovereign institutions, National Oil Corporation, the Central Bank. Those were the major institutions because the issue of the way that the oil revenues were distributed was a driver of the conflict. The fact that there were blockades on oil, that oil would be pumped, then it would stop for a period of time. So clearly, this controversy, this conflict over the division and distribution of resources was a major piece of the broader conflict in Libya. And so one of the things that we worked on, and I'm very proud of the work that the United Nations did in this regard, was to oversee the audit of the two central banks. It took a while. The audit didn't happen took a couple of years, but it was, I think, a very important exercise. And I think the results could have been more transparent, but that wasn't my decision. But the actual process. Because when you address this issue of transparency and accountability, it lessens, I believe, the likelihood of violent conflict, and it addresses real concerns within the country. So we had that, and of course, another major aspect of our work and my work in the United Nations was the human rights file. The many, many cases of people who were kidnapped by armed groups, who forcibly disappeared, like Member of Parliament Saham Sorgewa. And then during the course, I'm sure we'll get to this, but during the course of the attack on Tripoli, many humanitarian cases that arose that we directly tackled.
قبل أن ندخل في الحدث الساخن اللي هو الهجوم على طرابلس كما وصفتي في كتابك هجوم حفتر، في المؤتمر الجامع كان هناك خلاصات بنيت على نقاش طويل مع الليبيين. أظن في إحدى اللقاءات مع السيد غسان سلامة قال أن الجلسات تجاوزت 5000 ليبي جلست معهم البحث. أهم الخلاصات التي كان الليبيين يبحثون عنها في المؤتمر الوطني الجامع، يعني حابين أن تنعكس في مخرجات المؤتمر الوطني الجامع. هل تتذكري شيء من تلك النتائج والخلاصات اللي ناقشتوهن على مدى تقريبا عام؟
What struck me in the preparations for the national conference and those many meetings that were held inside Libya and in the diaspora, and the contact with many Libyans, whether in person or there was also a website where people were able to contribute and add their thoughts, was there were a couple of things. One was there was no doubt Libyans were not interested in further division of the country. Libyans want a whole and united country. They want their sovereignty to be protected. They were very disgusted with and tired of foreign interference in their country. It was also very clear that they wanted elections. They wanted parliamentary and presidential elections. Even at that time, and now we're many years later, there was a recognition that the institutions, and particularly the two elected chambers, had lost their legitimacy. And their legitimacy needed to be renewed only through the ballot box. So there was a big push for elections. There was also, of course, Libyans would like to see presidential elections. And that's entirely natural. The other issue, we've touched on this, is, how are the revenues managed? What are the mechanisms for ensuring transparency, accountability, and good stewardship of those revenues? A real focus on good governance, and with that, a strong emphasis on the need for decentralization in Libya. That one of the problems in the Qaddafi regime had been an over-centralization of power in Tripoli to the expense of other cities. Benghazi is where the rebellion against Qaddafi started, and I don't think that that's a coincidence, because it's where he started his own rebellion against the monarchy in 1969. So decentralization, it was a big focus and outcome. And then the whole issue of transitional justice and accountability for war crimes and grave human rights abuses.
هل تذكرين الأولويات؟ بمعنى هل كان الليبيين يفضلون استفتاء على الدستور أولا أم الانتخابات أولا؟ هل يفضلون انتخابات رئاسية أم انتخابات برلمانية؟ يعني هذه الأولويات السياسية التي لم تنتهي على مدار تقريبا 4-15 عام.
I know this is one of the central issues in the political negotiation, is which comes first, and this is what came up in the LPDF, and certainly towards the end of my time in Libya, it was always this question of what is the sequencing. So look, for the national conference, the way it was designed was that the Libyans would determine the sequencing of all of these events. So would you have, but my impression, and from my years of speaking with Libyans and negotiating amongst them, it's clear that there's a preference for simultaneous presidential and parliamentary elections. Where the issue of the draft constitution comes, there was a lot of difference amongst Libyans on this. I never came out with a clear right? Because the draft constitution became such a controversial subject in and of itself. I believe that settling the constitutional issue is very important for Libyans, because it's your social contract, right? It's your relationship between the citizen and the state.
أنت وصفتي قلتي أن أساسا الليبيون لا يفضلون أكل الخضار، يفضلون الذهاب إلى الطبق الرئيسي، يعني والخضار هنا كنت تقصدي الأساس الدستوري. فقبل ما نخش في 4-4، قبل ما ندخل في قصة 4-4، برأيك لماذا لا يفضلون كثيرا النقاش حول الأساس الدستوري؟ القادة الليبيين لماذا يتهربوا من النقاش حول أي أساس دستوري للعملية السياسية؟
Well, I think, and I can address this from being at the negotiating table where things fell apart, and this was in June of 2022. Look, the two issues that have always held up the constitutional talks are the participation of military officers as candidates, and also the dual nationality. Can dual nationals serve as the president of Libya? And that you always come up right to the end, and it just falls apart. Now, I think that's pretty obvious what the hindrance is there. And I don't believe that the entire constitutional sort of future of Libya should be held hostage by one person.
هل كانت فعلا هذه الخلافات الرئيسية بين الأطراف بمعنى الجنسية، مزدوجي الجنسية، مشاركة العسكر، والله هذه كانت فقط شمعات لتأخير الانتخابات؟ أنا أقصد من النقاش ربما كانت تستخدم فقط كفزعات.
It could be. I mean, I would have to climb into the minds of your Libyan political class. I don't really want to do that. But I guess you could make an argument that, yes, it was a pretext to just maintain the status quo, to just continue in their seats. I buy that, yes. I always want to maintain some optimism and to hope that politicians and those who have influence are really looking out for the good of the people. And it's clear to me, even today, as I observe Libya, that Libyans still want elections. And this is all quite achievable.
في نهاية فبراير 2019 كان في لقاء لم تكشف تفاصيله حتى اللحظة. يعني نحن اليوم على مسافة تقريبا 7 سنوات من ذلك اللقاء، لم تكشف تلك التفاصيل. حسب المعلومات أن اللقاء كان بين السراج وبين السيد حفتر وبحضور غسان سلامة، واستمر ل20 دقيقة. لكن حتى اللحظة ليس هناك أي تفاهمات حول الترتيبات. وجدت تصريحات لحضرتك في الشرق الأوسط تقولين أنك أنت أدرتي اجتماعات مع المساعدين على الهامش، وتم توزيع وظائف أو مهام أو نقاش حول ما الذي ينبغي فعله. ما الذي دار في أبوظبي؟
So let's go back a couple of months. Oh, actually almost a year. So one of the things that
لا ليست سنة 2019.
No, but I have to set the scene for you. I have to lay the table for what happened in Abu Dhabi. And really one of the major challenges that the UN mission faced, the leadership of the UN mission faced at that time, was this desire by countries to organize these little meetings between Libyans. And here we can go even to the Paris meeting in like July of 2017. There was another meeting which was just between Sarraj and Sarraj and Haftar, Roma, Thumma, Paris. There was another meeting, but that was with Arba. It was in May of 2018 with Haftar, Sarraj, Mishri and Aguila. And then there was Palermo, and it just, it became a bit of a joke, right? And it was just political tourism. You go, you have a meeting, مسرح السياسية. And siyaha, big time political tourism. I mean, Palermo was like, I think half of Libya came to that conference in Palermo. I mean, look, I know that these countries were trying to be helpful, right? Let's see if we can, get these guys to talk and agree on something, but they didn't. And it turned into like a big spectacle, a big show. So during, and again, this is in my book, during the Palermo meeting, which was in November, I think, of 2018, Haftar and Sarraj approached Ghassan Salama, and they said, we would like you to arrange a quiet meeting between the two of us. We know that we know the United Nations.
That's mean secret.
Confidential.
Okay.
Confidential meeting. We know that you are organizing the national conference. So we want to do this before the national conference. Okay, bye. Right? So it wasn't our idea. It was their idea. So we said, but we just don't want, to have like a meaningless, another just useless meeting. So let's prepare for this. Let's actually go through what are some of the issues. What is some of the sequencing that we can look at in terms of electoral events and a unified government. But let's also make sure that this little twosome, the duo, doesn't sort of take over from the national conference, because the national conference was the big inclusive event for Libyans. Okay, so that's when I led the meetings between the two groups of advisors, of the two gentlemen. We had like 3 sessions in Tunis in January of 2018. And then it was literally just trying to coordinate the different travel schedules of Haftar and Sarraj. And it happened, آخر لحظة, that they were both going to be in the UAE. Mr. Sarraj was going for some kind of family event, and Mr. Haftar was going for medical treatment. So that's how Abu Dhabi became because we had looked at, I think they were looking at Sardinia, they were looking at like different places. Even, by the way, we looked to do it inside Libya, like in Ghadames but just the logistics of getting the two gentlemen there were too difficult. So it was easier, ironically, for them to meet in Abu Dhabi. And so we took the outcome of the preparatory meetings, where there was quite a lot of consensus about about a unified government, about some kind of national security decision-making council, who would sit on the council. Because with the muhassasa, if the president is from the west, then the prime minister is from the east, or the head of parliament is from the east, and anyways, all of that. So it was looking at the different distribution of responsibilities, and they agreed on a kind of a set of principles. That was like February 27th or 28th of 2019. They agreed to meet again before the national conference.
And they meet in fighting.
Yeah. and then it fell apart.
أوكي، بس هنا كان في سردية تقول أن كان في اتفاق بين الرجلين على ترتيبات أمنية في العاصمة تسمح لحفتر بالدخول، وأن السراج تباطأ أو ألغى أو تراجع. هل هذا كان صحيح؟ لأن هذه السردية تستخدم لتبرير هجوم حفتر كما تصفيه على طرابلس.
I don't believe that. I don't believe that because I sat with Siraj in the day or days directly after the attack. And I just don't believe that he would have done that. So there was, I will say, there was a period in that Abu Dhabi meeting. So, I mean, I was present, but I wasn't in the room. Ghassan was in the room with them for a period. And then they asked just the two of them to meet. And they met for 20 minutes without anybody. Well, I'm sure that someone was listening, but they were just the two of them together in the room. What they said to each other, only those two gentlemen know.
Without Ghassan Salama.
بالضبط. For like 20 minutes. So that you would have to interview them if you wanted to know what they said. But I can tell you, based on the reaction of Mr. Siraj, based on what I witnessed, that there was no deal. That this attack was a shock.
طيب هذا اللقاء اللي امتد ل20 دقيقة، كيف كانت الرياكشنز، يعني التفاعلات الشخصين بعد اللقاء؟ كان هذه ممكن كانت تكشف جزء من الموضوع، يعني من التفاهمات. هل كان في غضب؟ هل كان في تفاهم؟ هل كان في تفاؤل؟ هل كان في يعني ما هي المشاعر التي سادت بعد اللقاء بين الرجلين؟
Well, I got to know Mr. Siraj much better than I got to know Mr. Haftar during my time in Libya. Mr. Siraj is always quite an easygoing, very, gentle man. But after this meeting, it was very clear, both of them, they were smiling. They seemed like that they had a good encounter. They had a good one-on-one session with each other. That's all I can say. They looked content. And that, therefore, we had some optimism. Could we, count on them 100%? Of course not. Very realistic about the challenges moving forward. But it looked like it had been a very positive meeting.
يعني هل تعتقد أن السراج تعرض للخديعة بعد هذا اللقاء، بمعنى كان في اتفاق ثم فوجئ مرة واحدة بالحرب؟
I can say that he was surprised by the attack. Yes, he was. They were shocked. There was shock in Tripoli. And the fact that, the UN Secretary General was present.
هذا السؤال الذي يعني كنت بنسألك. يعني نتخيل الآن يوم 4/4، نرجع بالذاكرة تقريبا 6 سنوات، 4 من إبريل 2019، الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة موجود في زيارة نوعية إلى البلد، وتطلق صافرة الحرب. بكل تأكيد أن حفتر لن يفعل هذا بملء إرادته الشخصية. كان في مكالمة ترامب بدعم إقليمي. هل يعني في رأيك هل كان إطلاق الحرب هو إرادة محلية لحفتر، بين قوسين كما يسميه البعض نزق شخصيته التي تميل إلى المغامرات، أم أن كان توقيت إقليمي محبوك ومحسوب؟
What I can tell you is the conversations that we had before the attack, and then what we learned right after the attack began. So, of course, we're not naive. We could see that there was some kind of military buildup happening. We certainly had UN employees who were tracking this and saying, "This doesn't look good." So there was an Arab League meeting that took place in Tunis in the last week of March. Last week of March. And in that meeting, so the Secretary General was there and Dr. Salama was there. And they were asking, is there something being planned? Everyone was, no, there are no indications. There are no indications. They went to Cairo after that. They had conversations there. They asked. And this was like the day before. And by the way, I was in Tripoli at that time, and I was meeting with the general staff, the chief of the general staff of the armed forces in Western Libya in Tripoli. And Salim Joha, who was the deputy, came into the room and said, there are forces that are moving. Mm-hmm. I called our team in Cairo. I called, the Ghassan and the Secretary General. And I said, hey, but they kept on being told, no. It's just, don't worry. Yes. And then the authorities, all of the countries that we were talking to, by the way, said, no, we don't see anything. There's nothing, So it's always been a question for me, whether he just acted and heard what he wanted to hear, because he had made very clear in some past conversations, yes, that he wanted to, he was ready to move into Tripoli and get rid of the terrorists, and, all of that stuff. But he had also engaged in political dialogue. So he had really had two sets of talking points that he would use that were not, they were in contradiction with each other, let's say. So then the Secretary General arrives into Tripoli on the night of the 3rd, and the attack takes place on the 4th. And it's quite shocking because the Secretary General came to Libya to support the National Conference. And, by the way, his wasn't a last-minute visit. We were planning his visit for 3 weeks. They knew exactly when he was coming. So also the decision to attack on that day really is quite stunning. Right? Very disrespectful.
بالضبط هذا السؤال كان بالإمكان أن تؤجل أسبوع على الأقل. بالإمكان أن تبدأ الحرب قبل وصول غوتيريش. هل كيف تعاطى الأمين العام مع القضية مع الحرب التي اندلعته هو في وسط طرابلس؟
Well, it was a difficult day and we had lots. So we scrubbed he went to see Mr. Siraj, of course. But we also arranged a meeting with some leaders from Misrata who came. They were accompanied by the then Minister of Interior, who was Fatih Bashagha. And they spent an hour or so with the Secretary General, and they were very clear that they were going to oppose this attack, that they were going to fight back. And then we had to decide, should the Secretary General go see Mr. Haftar, given what he had done? Should he go? Should he not go? We decided that he should go because he needed to tell him to stop the attack. That would be the message. You go, you meet, you say, stop the attack. This is not, as the Secretary General said, this is not going to be a cakewalk for you. I know this because I've just met with a lot of people in Tripoli who've told me they're going to fight back. So he went. It was a difficult meeting with Mr. Haftar. He was very stubborn. At the end of the meeting,
الاجتماع مع الأمين العام.
Yeah, the Secretary General told him, you need to stop. Mr. Haftar was not really interested in listening and hearing that. At the end of the meeting, the Secretary General, two things happened. One was he said, I would like to organize a meeting between you and Mr. Siraj, like 4 days or something, in Switzerland. Please get back to us, because we would like to stop this conflict and work through whatever these issues are. But as they were leaving, one of Mr. Haftar's advisors took Hassan Salama aside. And again, this is in the book. Said, we don't understand. Why are you saying these things? Why are you telling us to stop? Because we have the green light from Mr. Trump. And what? This was a shock. So then we discovered that there had been a phone call, like at the end of March, between Mr. Bolton and Mr. Haftar. Now, I don't know what was said in that meeting on the U.S. side. What I can tell you is how it was interpreted on the Libyan side, Mr. Haftar, which was, it's a green light. They felt that they had the okay from the United States to do this. I'm sure nobody in the State Department knew about this phone call, and nobody in the Pentagon knew about this phone call. So that was a very decisive moment.
يعني صحيح أنت في تلك اللحظة كنت مبعوثة أممية وتمثلي البعثة الأممية والأسرة الدولية، ولكن لديك خلفية مهمة وواسعة عن المؤسسات الأمريكية وكيف تفكر. هل بالنسبة لك كان واضح أن الاتصال مكالمة بولتون ومكالمة ترامب كانت خارج السياق المؤسساتي الطبيعي؟
Yes, that was my impression. And definitely, I can get to the Trump phone call did not take place until April 15th of 2019. The Bolton call, so that was well after the attack had started. The Bolton call was before, right? So I can speak in general because I wasn't working for the U.S. government. I retired. But in normal administrations, such a decision, because you had a U.S. policy which was articulated to support the United Nations mission that was putting together a national conference. That's your policy. Anything to change that policy, especially a major change, no more peace, we're for war, would normally go through a whole process, what's called the interagency process in Washington. The different departments, they meet and they decide, and then the decision goes up to the president. This does not happen in the Trump administration then and now. There's only one decision maker. And so this was shocking, right? And it really, it made me feel sick to my stomach that the UN mission had been stabbed in the back. And that this useless war that ended up costing so many lives and so much destruction had been started when it could have been stopped.
في تلك اللحظة الدبلوماسية الأمريكية في ليبيا كيف كانت ردة فعل؟ هل فوجئت مثل ما تفاجأت ستيفاني ويليامز ولا كان هناك يعني غرف مظلمة وسياق آخر؟
They were not in Libya. Remember, they were in Tunis. And I was in Libya. I didn't leave Libya at that time. My impression is that they were shocked. And then you get to the Trump phone call, which is the same story. It's like not coordinated at all. It takes place, phone call to Haftar, and then there is a very unusual 4-day gap between the actual phone call and the production of a statement on the phone call. And this is because there was everyone else in the U.S. government was shocked that this was taking place. And so there were all of these discussions about what should the state. Anyways, it doesn't matter because the message was Trump supports Haftar. That was it. So yes, that was when we in the United Nations really felt that we were abandoned by the Security Council because the Security Council went quiet. Not one word.
طيب في بعد هذه خلاص الحرب بدأت والمحاور توزعت في طرابلس. كيف كان موقف السراج والمجلس الرئاسي، وكيف كان موقف مصراتة من البعثة الأممية؟ يعني هل كان في شعور بأن الأمم المتحدة تمارس دبلوماسية خفية لصالح حفتر، وبالتالي في شعور بأن، لأن هذا كان واضح في تلك اللحظة، كان في اعتقاد بأن في خيانة دبلوماسية تحدث. هل هذا شعرت به في التعامل؟
Mia. I felt this. Yes. I mean, it was really just such a stressful and discouraging time because, of course, Libyans, they're looking at what is this United Nations where, you have the special envoy who briefs the Security Council. The Security Council says, we support you, Mr. Special Envoy. And then suddenly there's this attack. What's going on? What's going on though? What al-kawalis, and so yes, there was a great feeling of this is treachery, we've been deceived. There was a lot of anger. Yes, there was a lot of anger, and we took that anger because, we didn't leave Tripoli. We stayed in Libya. And we absorbed all of that anger, and we worked with all of the UN agencies to address the needs of the people in Tripoli who were by then having to leave their homes because of the violence and the attacks. Yes, the Misrata, there was a lot of anger from people in Misrata. So we just, put our heads down. We said, we're not going anywhere. We're going to stay with the Libyans. We're going to see if we can build something back up here to show that conflict, violence is not the answer.
أثناء الهجوم أو التحضيرات قلت إنك اتصلتي ببعض السلطات من بين مثلا السيد سالم مشحار اللي كان نائب رئيس الأركان، والجميع كانوا يقولون لا شيء يطبخ، الأمور كما هي. بعد الهجوم مثلا على سبيل المثال السيد سالم مشحار ومن اتصلت بهم، هل تغيرت موقفهم؟
I should be very clear. The authorities that we were were the external actors, not internal actors. We weren't hearing. We were watching like the forces were building up. Yes, Salam Joha was the deputy and chief of staff at the time, but he, as you know, then he withdrew, and I didn't hear from him after that. He came in. He's told us that the attack was happening. This was when I was meeting with the chief of staff, or that the forces were moving, and he felt that the attack was happening. But he withdrew after that. He went home to Misrata, and I understand that because the idea of Libyans fighting Libyans is very sad. So. But I would say that overall, and of course those days, we would meet with General Haddad as well. Osama Joueli, General Joueli was key. There was a lot of anger and disappointment.
الحرب مثلت تغير في شكل الوساطة. كنت أنت حضرتك سيد ستيفاني وسيد غسان سلامة تعولوا على وساطة من الداخل إلى الخارج، بمعنى بناء توافقات داخلية مؤتمر غدامس ثم إخراج هذه التوافقات إلى الخارج. الذي حدث بعد ذلك هو العكس، بناء توافقات في الخارج ثم يعني محاولة تطويعها في الداخل أو محاولة البناء عليها في الداخل. يعني كيف جاءت هذه الفكرة؟ طبعا أكيد جاءت تحت ضغط الواقع، ولكن أن ترحب ألمانيا ويحدث مؤتمر برلين كانت هذه نقلة مهمة في دعم الدبلوماسية الأممية في ليبيا.
Right. Yes, well, it became very clear. So in the days and weeks following Haftar's attack, the UN, the United Nations Security Council, became an entirely sterile body. They couldn't even issue a statement, let alone a resolution. So we realized, and this was because the Trump administration, its position had changed so radically. And certainly the Russians, they were backing Haftar. So, we knew where they stood. So you couldn't have consensus within the Security Council. So you needed to look elsewhere, to look for another forum to rebuild the international understandings on the Libya file. And this was when Ghassan he was talking during the summer, so like 2 or 3 months after the attacks were launched. He was in conversation with the Germans and the Swedes, mostly. And the Swedes, by that time, were already busy with the Yemen file. They had taken on the Yemen mediation in terms of organizing things in Sweden under that umbrella. So that we turned to Germany, and Germany made a lot of sense at that time. Why Germany? And there were really 3 reasons. One was because the Germans abstained on Security Council Resolution 1973 that authorized the NATO intervention in 2011. Germany abstained. The other thing is that Germany was, at that time, on the Security Council in 2019, and the Germans had the presidency of the Sanctions Committee on Libya. So they were very well versed with Libya. And finally, that Germany it's a heavyweight country in Europe, right? So, and it has big trading and investment relationships with key countries who were, intervening, shall we put it that way, in the Libya file. So it was neutrality, knowledge, and influence. And so then Ghassan went in August of 2019, met with Chancellor Merkel, and she agreed to take this on. Because they were also worried. Already there was the big migrant crisis in Europe, and, having another conflict in the Mediterranean was not something that, mature Europeans were.
بالتزامن مع مؤتمر برلين كان في مؤتمر موسكو الذي جمع السراج وحفتر كلنا نحن. طبعا لم يكن هناك دور للبعثة الأممية، والسيد غسان سلامة في ظهور أخير يقول أن اتفاق موسكو الذي كان يوقع سرق نص اتفاق برلين. كان واضح أن غسان سلامة وستيفاني ويليامز لم يكونا يرغبا بأن يسرق منهم دور الوساطة، بمعنى أن يوقع الاتفاق الذي عملا عليه في موسكو بعيدا عن المظلة الأممية. لكن حدث ما لم يكن في الحسبان. حفتر انسحب من اللقاء ولم يوقع. وهنا السؤال: ما هي الضغوط التي مارست على حفتر، أو أي دوافع دفعت حفتر للانسحاب من هذا الاتفاق في وجهة نظرك أو من خلال معلوماتك؟
Well, you would have to ask Mr. Haftar, because about what his motives were. What I can tell you was it was pretty clear that Ankara and Moscow were having their own bilateral discussions on Libya. And by that time, the Turkish intervention in the Libya file was clear. There had been the signing of the 2 memorandum of understanding in the fall of 2019, and then you started to see the introduction of Syrian mercenaries and more weapons for the forces in Western Libya. Of course, the Russians had already been well engaged, along with the Emiratis and the Egyptians, with Mr. Haftar for a long period, with Russian mercenaries on the ground and lots of weapons and drones pouring in from Mr. Haftar. So that, and again, you'd have to ask these governments, what were they doing? What was their motivation? Was it that they were nervous maybe about what Berlin would produce?
سأسألهم إن شاء الله.
They would.
إذا أتيحت لي فرصة، لكن من خلال معلوماتك يعني.
But so look, they didn't. By the way, those 2 governments didn't tell us they were doing this. They just did it. We learned about it from. We didn't even hear about it from Mr. Haftar. We heard about it from Mr. Siraj, who I think was under a lot of pressure, by the way, to sign. But it didn't work.
أي
right?
نوع من الضغط؟
I think there was official pressure from Ankara, from the Turkish authorities. But he in the end, Haftar didn't sign. So, and I think at that point, and we could see this, because this was in early January, maybe second week of January of 2020, Haftar really thought he could win. He was still very confident. So he just wasn't interested.
Mm.
He really had it in his brain that he could take Tripoli.
تكررت الحادثة تقريبا في برلين، ويعني في الصحف أذكر كوريلا ديلا سيرا الإيطالية قالت أن حفتر تسبب بغضب المستشارة أنجيلا ميركل، انتظرته واتصلت به في غرفته ولم يرد. فهل لنفس الأسباب امتنع حفتر، وما الذي جرى تحديدا في برلين؟
Well, again, trying to get into Mr. Haftar's brain.
هذه المرة أنت حاضرة.
But I can tell you what happened. So we had preferred in the United Nations, I would say there was a difference between us and the Germans on this decision to invite Mr. Siraj and Mr. Haftar to Berlin, because we had really wanted it to be an external conference, that it was very important for there to be the appearance, if not the reality, of an international understanding that the Libyans had to stop the conflict and return to talks. Okay? So we knew, because of the previous experience, like in Paris in 2018, when the 4 guys, met with Macron, they refused to sign the document. In Palermo, there was another disagreement. So we knew, like, if you brought them, probably Mr. Siraj would be very, nice and would cooperate, but Mr. Haftar probably not. We know. We had already experienced these kinds of situations with them. So, but Chancellor Merkel had and she was, I have to say, amazing, of course, using her influence and Germany's relations with all of these countries, which is very complicated. But she had flown to Moscow after that failed attempt by the Russians and Turks to sign a ceasefire. And we understood that one of Mr. Putin's requirements for the Russians to attend the Berlin leaders meeting would be for the Libyans to be invited. So therefore they came. And of course, Mr. Siraj was very cooperative. And the idea had been to have, at the end of the day, after the statement was approved, the conclusions of the conference, after the operational paper for the United Nations mission was approved, that the Libyans, Mr. Siraj and Mr. Haftar, would be invited to meet with all the leaders and to, have a discussion about the conclusions. Of course, Mr. Siraj said, I'll come, but Mr. Haftar disappeared. They told us he was taking a nap. Kailula. He was a no-show. But look, in the end, the conference took place. We had the conclusions. We had the operational paper. It was all very clear about what the way forward would be. And it resulted in a UN Security Council resolution, which was the first time the Council had done anything serious on Libya for almost a year. Certainly since the attacks of April 2019. So that, that's just the reality. The messiness of mediation is that you have all these different personalities.
أوكي، وصلنا إلى نقطة انتهى فيها مؤتمر برلين. صحيح، على عدم رضا حفتر، كان يعتقد بين قوسين حسب ما تقولي أنه ممكن أن ينهي الحرب، ووصلنا إلى لحظة انسحاب الروس والانسحاب الروسي من مناطق غرب ليبيا، خصوصا ترهونة كانت، وحدثت في أيام، يعني تقريبا كان في 6 ساعات انتهت الحرب. فهل هذا كان بإرادة دولية أم كان بتفاهم تركي روسي في تقديرك؟ أم أن الروس شعروا بأن الإرادة الدولية هي أقوى من قدرتهم على البقاء في منطقة معزولة عنهم استراتيجيا؟ تاريخيا الروس ليس لديهم موطئ قدم في ليبيا، يعني من بعد الحرب العالمية الثانية ليس لديهم وجود في هذه المنطقة، وبالتالي وجودهم عاري استراتيجيا. فأي سيناريو كان هو السبب الرئيسي في الحرب؟ أم أن فعلا الدعم التركي للقوات الوفاق وكذا كان أيضا سبب مهم؟
So I think it was a combination. There were lots of factors that went into this, but I have no doubt that it was due to the Turkish support for the Libyan forces in the West that assisted them in pushing Haftar and the Russian mercenaries out of Western Libya to the cessation of hostilities line between Sirte and Jufra. And that there was coordination, I believe, that there was coordination between the Russians and the Turks, particularly as regards the withdrawal of the Russian mercenaries. That couldn't have happened, like they couldn't have left so peacefully without, having any incidents, had there not been some coordination. So I believe that happened.
Yeah.
And that it became clear, and it became clear to the Russians, obviously, and to Mr. Haftar's other foreign supporters, that he couldn't do this. That what he thought would be a 3-day blitz into Tripoli had turned into a 15-month war of attrition that he was now losing.
هنا بدأ دور ستيفاني ويليامز يكبر شيئا فشيئا. كنت أنت شخصيا مشرفة على اتفاق إطلاق النار في جنيف في أكتوبر. ما الذي يعني أنت حتى في النقاشات كل ما نتحدث معك على اتفاق وقف إطلاق النار في ذهن الليبيين أهم شيء قمت به هو الحوار السياسي، في تصورك أهم شيء قمت به اتفاق وقف إطلاق النار، لماذا؟
Well, look, I think they're all important, but in terms of timing. So let's go through, because I think and I know Libyans like to jump directly into the political because that's just maybe more interesting and controversial. But it's very important to, I think, recount and remember what led up to those events. And the most important thing was that after the guns went silent in June of 2020, we had started the 5+5 talks in January, and then we had another in January 2020, so right after the Berlin conference, we had another round in February. But at that time, the two parties refused to meet face-to-face because the war, and this was particularly from the Western delegation, because the war was still hot on the ground, and while we were meeting in January and February, Tripoli was being attacked. It was being bombed. The port was bombed. The airport was continually targeted. Hospitals, schools, you know what happened. So that having the guns go silent through that cessation of hostilities was really important in encouraging the two sides in the military talks to re-engage with each other. So they started to talk, and this was, by the way, we were doing this all during COVID, so for many months there were no meetings in person. So we started through Zoom, through the online sessions, and they gradually built up their trust.
وربما هذا كان السبب في نجاح الاجتماعات أن الزوم خفف من ثقل اللقاء المباشر.
Right,
وفي نفس
exactly.
الوقت
It warmed them up.
أيوة.
Then there was a preparatory meeting that took place in Egypt at the end of September, where there were some representatives from the two sides who met in person. It was a low-level meeting. It wasn't a high-level meeting, but that also helped, just to warm things up a little bit. And all of the contacts continued, and a lot of the agreement had already been written. We had done the writing with the two teams starting in January and February and just continuing, just quiet work. And then at some point, probably towards the end of the first week of October, they said, we're okay now to meet in person. And then we prepared for the talks in Geneva. We didn't have any expectations that, an actual agreement would be signed. But I do think that the fact that there was no more violence, that the oil had resumed, the oil production had resumed, that there was some life now in the political dialogue or negotiations, that there were contacts that were underway that had started in July, kind of track 2 conversations, that there was a readiness, like, okay, maybe it is now well prepared for a formal agreement on a ceasefire. It also helped, by the way, that all these guys knew each other. I mean, these officers, they all, grew up in, the Qaddafi army, such as it was. And so they were not strangers to each other. And that helped. And leadership helped. There was certainly General Abu Shahma, who really became like the voice of the 5+5. I think he helped, and there were definitely other individuals there, including now the late General Fatori Gharabil, as well as some of the individuals, officers in Mr. Haftar's delegation. So that all helped. And by the end of the week, they told us that they were ready to sign. And we told New York, who they were surprised that it happened so quickly, but it did happen. I mean, the end, tying everything up happened so quickly. I also think that what helped us actually was COVID, because you didn't have all the physical interference of other countries. So, we were able to put a bubble over our talks because you couldn't have the physical contact. They leave the meeting room and there's a foreign diplomat right outside the door, something like that, right? So I have to say, I think that did help, and they were ready. And two other things happened around that period. In early September, Mr. Siraj asked to see me, and he told me...
September 2020.
Yeah. September, I can give you the date, September 9th. September 9th, 2020. Mr. Siraj, this is after, the war is over. The hostilities have ended. The oil is beginning to come back online. But he's very tired. Very tired. Here's a gentleman who signed up to be the president and prime minister of Libya for 2 years, starting in 2016, and it's now already 4 to 5 years. So he told me he wanted to leave. He wanted to go back to, his family. And I said, well, when, I was surprised. I didn't expect this. Exactly. I mean, I wasn't surprised, because it was very clear to me that he was exhausted. He had been not looking so well, just physical exhaustion. But I was surprised at how quickly he wanted to leave. So he told me he wanted to leave by the end of that month, so by the end of September.
أيضا هو كشخصية شخص بيروقراطي، ليست لديه شهوة السلطة والرغبة في الحكم. هذا سبب أيضا.
Right. Yes. And I mean, and he didn't have the easiest time with the other members of the presidential council. They were always arguing and, with each other. And it was, the government, there were some really good people in the government, but also there were some weak points in the government. So, he was ready to go. And he had made up it was very clear. He had taken his decision. But I said, hey, Fakhamat Rais, I cannot just, in 3 weeks, organize. He said, I want to leave. I want you to organize a political dialogue that allows me to leave as soon, by the end of September. I said, well, that's not going to happen, because I can't organize this in such a short period of time, because we were dealing with COVID. So I said, you're going to have to give me, at least 2 months, let's say 2. And that's basically what it took us, 2 months to organize it. So that's what led to the political dialogue being organized. Because after the ceasefire agreement, yes, that made the ground was more fertile, definitely. And the military officers were very clear with me. We've done our part. We've signed our agreement that we have an official ceasefire. Now the political class has to do their part.
أوكي. إذن الحوار السياسي كان مدفوع برغبة سراج في عدم البقاء، ليست لديه رغبة. أنا ظهر دبيبة لأول مرة قبل الحوار السياسي، كان في مونترو اللي هو تحضيري لقاء مونترو، ظهر في دبيبة لأول مرة. لا أذكر هو ممثل عن من، ربما كان ممثل عن صلاتها، كان لا أعرف ممثل عن من، ربما أنت تحيطين علما بالمثل. وبدأت الترتيبات، لكن لقاء مونترو قبل الحوار السياسي، على أي أساس اختير هؤلاء هذه الشخصيات؟ على أي أساس؟
So when we started the Track 2 process, and this was organized by the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Initially, it was just sort of very quiet conversations between representatives of Siraj and Aguila. And they said, we don't want any representation from Haftar. That was he's not to have a place at the political table, that his place is at the military talks, not here. Okay. Then we continued those conversations, or they under the umbrella of HD.
تقبل حفتر أنه غير موجود على الطاولة؟ أم أنه
he wasn't consulted.
يعني يوضع أشخاص آخرين عن طريق عقيدة.
By the way, that was our view too. The military had its track. There's a military track. This is a political track, and we still had an economic track. So then we broadened through the facilitation organization of HD. It was broadened, this Track 2 process, to start to bring in more people. And that was on the basis of representation by city. So there were two representatives of Misrata, there were representatives of Siraj, there were representatives of the former regime was brought in.
Bashara
was represented both, I think, by one guy and by the city.
I think.
Well, actually, Mr. Bashaga recommended both, proposed both names for Misrata, including Mr. Debeba.
كانت بيبة يمثل بشاغة في تلك اللحظة.
He represented Misrata, but the name came through
بشاغة. يعني اسم بيبة في مونترو طرح عن طريق بشاغة.
So the way that this was organized was you would have key cities and individuals. So Aguila had his representatives. Siraj had his representatives. Bashaga had a representative. There was also Mishri had a representative, and there was like a Zawiya representation. Of course, Tripoli was also represented through Siraj's representation. And then there were the two individuals from Misrata. But the names were recommended, yes, by Mr. Bashar.
هذه كانت الخطوة الأولى في الحوار السياسي. يعني أفضت لاحقا إلى الحوار السياسي الموسع في تونس.
In the sense that a roadmap was discussed there. It wasn't the roadmap that so it was like a testing ground, and that happened, by the way, before Mr. Siraj told me that he wanted to leave. So then we started the organization of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum.
يعني في سؤال المليون في السياسة الليبية جاء ملتقى الحوار السياسي. على أي أساس اختير هؤلاء 75 شخص؟ يعني مش كأشخاص لكن كتمثيل داخل.
Right. So there were 75 people altogether, right? 26 of them were selected directly by the two chambers. We had nothing to do with that selection, although we said to them, and this goes back to end of 2019, beginning of 2020, when we were organizing for the first, dialogue that took place in Geneva in February, but that political dialogue failed, right? Because higher state council, Majlis al-Dawla, refused to participate. And then all these people from the East withdrew. It became a big drama. So for this dialogue, they had already selected the members from the two chambers, Parliament. So 26 people, one woman, which is not acceptable to have one woman. 26. And so then we added, then the mission selected everybody else. So about 50 people. So from that, I was determined to have a women's bloc, that there would be a representation of women in this political dialogue, not a symbolic, but a real representation of women who were lawyers and activists and politicians and representatives of their community. So there was that. Then we had tribal leaders. Then we had, I would say representatives of the east of Libya. And by that, we mean representatives who reflected Mr. Haftar's views. We also had, we had tribal representation from the east. We had representatives from the former regime. We had representatives from the south. We had representatives from Western Libya, from the different cities and from different ethnic groups. We had Amazigh, we had Tabu, and we had Tuareg. So it was really but we were limited by the numbers because we organized this during COVID. And that was really 75 was, I wish that we could have done the 160 that we had planned for the national conference in 2019, but it just was not possible.
يعني هل منح مجلسين نواب الدولة الثلث المعطل نسبيا كان فلسفة والله جاء بالصدفة انهم ياخذوا تقريبا ثلث المقاعد؟
That came under the umbrella of the Berlin conclusions. The operational paper out of Berlin stipulated that you had to have representation from the two chambers. Because it was always assumed, right or wrong, but we were still operating, remember, we're still operating under the Libyan political agreement, which recognizes these two chambers. So that any product from a political dialogue would need to go back to the chambers, right? It would need, if legislation was required, if a constitutional basis, so you couldn't just, I would have loved, personally, not to have those guys in the room because they obstructed, and they still obstruct. But the reality was you had to have them there because it was, part of the international agreement that they're present, and because you needed some instrument for decisions.
أوكي. عندما صمم ملتقى الحوار، لا نريد أن ندخل في التفاصيل لأن التفاصيل تقريبا أغلب الليبيين يعرفونها، لكن عندما صمم ملتقى الحوار بتشكيلته قيل أنه صمم حتى ينتج في النهاية قائمة بشاغة عاقلة صالح، بمعنى أن كان هناك رغبة دولية في أن أو إقليمية تركيا روسية في إنهاء الصراع، ولكن في أن يحظوا بمنافع ما بعد الحرب. وفي نفس الوقت كان بشاغة نجم في حرب طرابلس، وفي المقابل عقيلة لم يظهر كأنه مؤيد للحرب، فكانت كأنها صفقة مكسب للجميع، مكسب للإقليم، مكسب لمصر وتركيا وروسيا، ومكسب أيضا لمصراتة لعقيلة الذي كان موقفه أفضل. هل فعلا كان في ميل على الأقل في الداخل لأن حتى أثناء النقاشات لأن تكون هذه هي قطعة الكرزة التي تنهي أو تجمل هذا المشهد، أن تنتهي القائمة قائمة عقيلة وبشاغة وأن تفرز هذا النتيجة؟
I don't know. You'd have to really ask the Libyans who were involved what their thinking was. I was I was surprised by that ticket because they didn't know each other. They had never really met, as far as I knew. So it's strange to partner with somebody that you don't. But I guess that was also the story of the presidential council of 9 people who had never really known each other. So maybe this is just the way the Libyan politicians organize. I don't know. So, but yes, I think that kind of came together pretty early on in the process, and I think it engendered very strong reactions, both in favor and against. Personally, and I don't know. I mean, I think in general, Libyans spend a lot of time focusing on the external actors. I can't say that there was a particular sort of external, that this was being driven. Not like we can get to it later, because like a year later, yes, there was an external hand in this, trying to form this second government in late 2021, 2022. But at that time, I felt that was more of an internal. The Aguila Bashaga thing was more internal.
طيب سيد استفري، في موضوع مهم اللي هو متعلق بالرشاوى، وهذه الإجابة عن هذا السؤال في نظر كثيرين إن هي تنعكس سلبا وإيجابا على شرعية السلطة الموجودة. أنا على الأقل يعني تواصلت مع أكثر مصدر وقالوا لي إن في لجنة من الخبراء التقت ب3 أعضاء لملتقى حوار جنيف، على الأقل 3 أعضاء، وحققت معهم بالخصوص. أنت باعتبارك كنت موجودة في جنيف وكنت قريبة من الكواليس وكنت جالسة في اللوبي معهم، شن سمعتي عن قصة الرشاوى، وهل كنت على علم فعلا بالقضية؟
So I can tell you I was shocked to see the only thing I saw was newspaper articles, right? Because I had left the UN by that. I left at the end of the Geneva dialogue. A new envoy came in. I was not consulted. No one called me. No one asked for. I've never seen anything. I've never seen any evidence. But if they had asked me, if this was indeed something that the panel of experts had discovered, they should have published it. I think it's worse to hide. And by the way, it goes against the whole principle of transparency. Transparency means that you're transparent on everything that occurs. And by the way, if such actions had occurred, if there was evidence, that is a clear indication of obstruction of the political process, and it means that the people involved would have been and should have been subject to sanctions, because the international community did use sanctions previously.
يعني أنت يعني ليست لديك أي خلفية.
No.
لم تناقش المسألة قدامك.
No, I was out of the UN. I saw the press reports. I was shocked, of course. My principle has always been, and if I had been consulted, if there was evidence, it should have been published.
أقصد أثناء الحوار ما كانش في أي مؤشرات.
No, and in fact, and I wrote about this in the book, I actually contacted the panel before the dialogue started to say, hey, I'm, about to launch this whole process. I know that you guys are monitoring. Please let me know if there's something that I should know. Nothing. So, look, again, transparency, sunlight on everything. But then I would also say that government that was produced, by the way, won a huge vote of confidence from the parliament. Like, what was it, 130 some? A month later.
Okay. أنا الآن مش حنسألك، بس حنوريك صور ونبيك تعلقي لي عليهم. هذه أذكر الصورة اللي هي ريكوجين، وكان في 3 صور ظهرت. كانت صور.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I write about this in my book. Yeah. That was in January of 2022. After I had returned as the special advisor. And I was doing a tour of the capitals. I went to Cairo, Istanbul, and I got an invitation to go to Moscow. Now, this happened, like 3 weeks before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This was end of January, 2022. I had been to Moscow before. I visited Moscow in I went one time when I was the deputy with Hassan, and then I went right after the ceasefire agreement in 2020. I can't remember the sequencing exactly. And those visits had been quite normal, just diplomatic visits. I mean, when there are always guys who sit in the lobby of a hotel, right? If you're like a diplomat or an official, and they're watching you. They're, whether it's mukhabarat, whether it's, you don't know. I mean, they're there. There's security. So it would not be unusual. And these guys all wore masks. They all had the COVID mask. So it would not be unusual. And I remember that we were very tired. There was a blizzard in Moscow that day, so it took us a long time to get from the airport. And we just wanted to go to our hotel rooms and rest a little bit before the dinner. I should have. Now, I thought about it later because, nobody in Moscow wore the COVID masks because they had this whole thing like COVID was this conspiracy or whatever, wasn't a real thing. So I should have thought, why are these guys wearing masks? But I was tired. Maybe I wasn't, as we say, I wasn't maybe on my A game. So yeah, I guess this guy gets in the elevator. All I remember is he said hello, and I got off at the next floor, and that was it. So it was a setup. They were trying to create a story. I never had any interaction with him. This person, now, was it Prigozhin himself? Was it, because he had like lookalikes, he had guys who posed for him or whatever, they pretended to be him.
لم يفتح أي موضوع للنقاش.
No, there was no discussion. There was nothing. I got off the elevator. I went to my room. We went out to dinner. We had the whole next day of meetings. Then we're out at dinner the next night, and all the stuff lights up on my phone on social media. I'm like, what's going on? And then we pieced it together, and they made up this whole stupid story. But I have to say, at that point, I became frightened. I was scared. Because remember, we lost 3 of our colleagues were killed in Libya in July of 2019. A crime that's never been solved in Benghazi. And I had UN staff with me. Okay, I'm a UN employee, but I'm also an American citizen. So I have a certain immunity. But these people don't. So I thought it was a very dirty and stupid thing for them to do. And I have no doubt, 100% that the Russian government was involved. How did they know where we were? They were following us around. Who gave them that information? So it was dirty. And then, of course, we see everything that happened after that in Ukraine. For my part, as soon as I left Russian airspace, as soon as I got on the ground in Europe, I called New York and I said, you really have to be careful before you send UN employees in here again. This is not proper. It's not diplomatic. It's not according to our protocols. So that's the story.
من خلال نقاشي مع بعض الأشخاص اللي التقوا بيك في أكثر من مناسبة، قالوا لي أن ستيفاني ويليامز تلقت تهديدات روسية في لحظات معينة أثناء إدارتك للوساطة في ليبيا. يعني أي تهديدات تلقيتها؟ أي نوع من التهديدات؟ تهديدات مباشرة؟
It was quite clear that they didn't like the fact that I was the UN mediator. So there was a direct, I mean, the Russian...
هل تلقيتي تهديدات مباشرة؟ نوع التهديدات أيضا.
The Russian ambassador in New York went after me, like in an open speech, personally. And yes, I mean, there were some security, I will say, there were some security concerns. I'll keep it at that.
أوكي. جاء موعد انتخابات 2021 24 ديسمبر 2021 ولم تحدث الانتخابات. وكان عند كثيرين أن هذه الخارطة صممت كي لا تعمل، أنها صممت بس كي تنتج سلطة تنفيذية ولكن كي لا تنتج انتخاب، لأن كان بالإمكان أن توضع في داخلها شروط واشتراطات تنهي الأجسام القائمة، على الأقل أن تفجر الوضع القائم إن لم تصنع واقع جديد. فلماذا يعني لم تستطع الأمم المتحدة معالجة مسألة الانتقال في ليبيا؟
Well, I don't think that the roadmap was designed or set up for failure. The roadmap that was produced in the LPDF meeting in November of 2020 was very time limited. It had certain goals with dates set, with time periods. Unfortunately, yes, it's true. They blew past the time periods, and there was no consequence for that. So, for instance, the two chambers had 60 days to produce a constitutional basis. When they missed that, there was no sort of immediate reaction, which there needed to be. I think that the international community became quite complacent and thinking that, well, you know, the institutions, the Libyans will just do this. And a lot of the pressure came off. There had been quite a lot of pressure to produce political results. And then it was like, oh, there's a united government. Look, Libyans are, and it certainly was true. You know, Libyans were traveling back and forth to Tripoli, and like a lot of the tension, you know, was gone. But you needed at the same time to keep the pressure on so that the political class, the ruling class, just didn't get back into their comfort zone, which was to delay things. Yes, these people do not want to leave their chairs. We know that. So, and then I think that the way that the electoral laws were produced later that year, in September, without consensus, and then were welcomed by the international community, which did lay the groundwork to kill the elections. It was the electoral laws, not the LPDF roadmap, that killed the elections. The electoral laws who opened the door on anyone to run for president. So when there were something like, 99 candidates? And then you had all of the controversy over the candidacies of Saif and Haftar and Dbeibeh. That's what killed the elections. So Saif wanted for war crimes. Dbeibeh, who took an oath before all of Libya, before the LPDF, in writing and orally, saying he would not run for president. He lied. Saif was seen as a threat, and Haftar was rejected by half the country since he decided to attack the capital. So there was no consensus on these candidates. And the fact that the electoral laws were designed in order to allow this to happen meant that it was, you know, as we say, it was like in the cradle, it was strangled. But that was not because of the LPDF roadmap. And I challenge anyone to go back and
نقطة مهمة.
look at.
أوكي، نقطة مهمة. أنت رتبتي يعني قلت إن مشاركة سيف ودبيبة وحفتر كان سبب رئيسي في وعد الانتخابات. طيب لو رتبنا الانتخابات أو رتبنا هذه المشاكل الثلاثة في وجهة نظرك بالأولوية، يعني هل لو شارك دبيبة فقط كان ممكن تحدث انتخابات؟ هل لو شارك حفتر فقط؟ هل لو شارك سيف فقط؟ يعني من الأكثر، ما المشكلة الكبرى بالنسبة على الأقل للمجتمع الدولي؟ من هو صاحب المشكلة الكبرى في المشاركة؟
I think the three of them are problems, you know. So just there are candidates around whom there's no consensus.
يعني على سبيل المثال سيف قد يرفض دوليا، لكن حفتر ودبيبة قد لا يرفض دوليا.
Perhaps, yes, right. But also I think, well, but the point is, who's accepted domestically in Libya, right? And by the way, could any of these candidates have campaigned throughout the country? Saif is like in a cave in Zintan. How's he going to campaign to be president? Debebo not welcomed in the east or the south of the country. Haftar not welcomed in the west of the. So, I mean, it was set up. Yes, the electoral laws set the scene for failure. And then the Electoral Commission just said no. It was, in the end, it was the decision of the Electoral Commission to postpone the elections.
أنت حاولتي وقمتي بمحاولة أخيرة لإنقاذ الانتخابات عبر اجتماع عقيلة والمشري في جنيف في يونيو 2022. أوكي، مهم أن نسمع وجهة نظرك في هذا الاجتماع، لأن كثيرين يقولون أن عقيلة صالح كان قريب من التوقيع، ولكن يعني في لحظة ما صار تدخل وتراجع عقيلة عن هذا الاتجاه.
Yes, and I do write about this in my book as well. So yes, I mean, we had these talks that took place primarily in Cairo for the constitutional framework. We had really achieved a lot of progress. I'm particularly pleased, I was, with the progress that we achieved on the issue of decentralization, which was detailed in the proposed draft with the different levels of government and even apportioning the distribution of revenues amongst the different regions. This was more than any document had ever proceeded. And there had been other sort of controversial subjects that were tackled. But at the end, at the third round in Cairo, there was still the issue of participation of military officers and dual nationality. But there were formulas that were, and it was being intensively worked between the two sides. And so we came to Geneva, and the first meeting that we had was great. And they agreed on the way forward. They agreed on the draft. We set a time for the formal ceremony for the next day. We were organizing everything with the UN in Geneva. We went back to our hotels. And in the middle of the night, I was awoken by members of the UN team to say that the agreement had fallen apart. So immediately, like in the middle of the night, we convened everybody to say, hey, what's going on? And it was back to a conflict on that language, particularly regarding dual nationality, as to if a candidate went past the first round, like at what point would they renounce their other nationality? And we tried again, many, many formulas, and it was just clear to me that Aguila could not move forward. He couldn't. I did not know at that time, but I discovered in the next couple of days after I left Geneva that there was the deal that was worked out in Abu Dhabi on the oil, the National Oil Corporation. I believe, no one's ever told me that, but I believe if you add up the two things, that killed.
أبوظبي بين الحكومتين بين الشرق والغرب.
Yes. Yeah. The changing, when Mustafa Sanella was fired and replacements were brought in. Yeah.
أنا بس يهمني إن نحكوا على عقيلة، يعني كيف كانت ردة فعله، كيف
He just couldn't.
لكن كان قريب جدا من التوقيع.
Yeah, he was close. I believe so. You'd have to ask him.
أنت الآن قلتي كلمة أن بالتوازي مع حوار جنيف كان هناك حوار آخر في أبوظبي، لكن ليس حول الانتخابات وإنما حول النفط، حول المال، حول السلطة. وفي كتابك ذكر كلمة مهمة، قلت أن القادة الليبيين يطلقون النار على بعضهم نهارا ولكنهم يتواطؤون ليلا بخلاف ذلك. هذا مهم أن نفهم كيف يفكر صانع القرار الليبي، أو هو الأمر الواقع اللي في ليبيا. كيف تفكر في لحظات مفصلية، في لحظة كان الناس عندهم رغبة كبيرة في الانتخابات ولكنها أجهضت ربما أيضا بتواطؤ دولي أو بسكوت دولي أو بصمت دولي. في رأيك ما هي المحركات الأساسية هو الأمر الواقع في ليبيا؟ يعني هل فعلا تحركهم ممكن انتخابات ولا تحركهم صفقات وبقاء في السلطة واستمرار في الحكم؟
So the way I describe the ruling class, there's a ruling class in Libya. There's no doubt. And yes, they do, we say, shoot each other or yell at each other during the day, and then at night they collude and they make deals. And it's because they all have a zero-sum mentality, akaliya, when it comes to power. And that's not only in Libya. I mean, I think that this is now more widespread than it should be in the world, maybe even in my country now. Yeah, they resist any movement towards change. They like their status, they like their benefits, and they're quite arrogant. They don't think anyone else can do it. They're the best poised, positioned to make these decisions. And they don't really care what the Libyan people want or think should happen. So it's and some of it I think also reflects this. Well, one time, a member of parliament told me, well, Gaddafi was, he ruled Libya for 42 years, we're just getting started. Like the whole idea of peaceful, democratic, voice of the people, evolutionary, change was absolutely foreign to this guy, even though he was elected. He was a member of parliament. So the election was only a vehicle for him to get power and then to stay as long as they possibly can. And this is really at the heart of all of the problems in Libya, is this total lack of legitimacy of the institutions, of all of the institutions. So that the only way that can, I believe still, the only way that can change is not through, the power of the bullet, it's through the power of the ballot box. And that's, I was really pleased to see, for instance, recently, so many Libyans participated in the municipal elections. I know that's not enough, but at least it shows that Libyans are they're getting out to vote. They're exercising their voting muscles. But the resistance to change is large. Now, what are the motivations of external powers? Well, what I observed was, and there was resistance, of course, to the UN process, because you have external powers who are not, they are suspicious of the process, and they only focus on the output or the results, and they only want a certain output. And if they see that things are moving in a direction where that their favored candidate or their outcome is not going to be produced, then they sabotage. No doubt.
اوكي، انت يعني قلتي انك تركتي الخارجيه الامريكيه في لحظه صعود ترامب، لانك لم تعودي قادره على رؤيه نفسك في المراه. اليوم ترامب في عهده الثاني، وايضا يمارس يعني نفس القرارات تجاه مثلا ليبيا وكثير من الدول، المنع من التأشيرات، المنع من اللجوء والهجرة. كيف تري عهد ترامب الثاني في وجهة نظر، من وجهة نظرك، بالنسبة للعرب عموما وبالنسبة للليبيين خصوصا؟
Well, if you don't mind, I'm first going to speak as, my views as an American, because I think that the second Trump administration has been much worse and much dangerous than any of us could have imagined. In fact, when I think about my country today and our leader, he does remind me of a Libyan. And the Libyan that he reminds me of is Mr. Qaddafi. He has a lot of the same characteristics as Mr. Qaddafi. He is a malignant narcissist. He thinks only of himself. He is dedicated now. There is a project in the United States to deconstruct our administrative state, and you've seen that in the canceling and the abolition of agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development, firing many federal government workers. This is, again, state deconstruction. And the other way that I think he resembles Mr. Qaddafi is he's an agent of chaos. I imagine that there were many years in the 42 years of Mr. Qaddafi's reign in Libya where Libyans would wake up and they would go, what's going to happen today? What are the decisions that are going to be made that are going to affect me? Just being on edge, not being able to predict the future, feeling insecure for yourself and your family and your community. Well, that's for many Americans now. And for many of the most vulnerable people in my country, that's what they're living every day. And I don't think any of us could have imagined that within 1 year, we would be where we are. So that's the domestic. And now let's go to the international, because yes, he is, and I finished that book. I put the final touches in the last week of January of 2025. And then it had to go to the printer. And that was just when he was getting started with the second term and he was making these crazy decisions every day. But now he really wants to tear down the entire international order. Whether it's all of these institutions that have guided the world since the most bloody of wars in the 20th century for 80 years. And it certainly wasn't a perfect international order. We saw what happened in Gaza, the genocide, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Bush's war on Iraq. Yes, but we had an international architecture that I believe actually prevented a lot more war than we could have seen. If all of that goes away, if it is just the strong, the biggest, strongest countries, it's the use of power, forget principles, forget international law, then I fear we're going to see many, many more wars, much more frequently. And that, yes, countries will be a lot more vulnerable. Smaller countries, even middle countries, will be a lot more vulnerable. So I saw the Canadian Prime Minister's speech at Davos, and I think he's absolutely right. We are at a rupture. The international system has been ruptured. And I think we're at a very dangerous tipping point right now. Whether we can pull it back together, how does this affect a country like Libya? Well, yes, Libya has been, it has been the focus of lots of regional interference and proxy warfare. So, and of course, the fact that you have divided government, divided administration, a very stubborn political and ruling class. This does not help, and I think it's a huge pity, because if Libyans could just pull it together, it's a great country, a beautiful country, small population, educated population, lots of resources. So I think these are really critical decisions that Libyans need to make.
برضو كأمريكية يعني في ليبيا ظهر ترامب بيواجه صهرة مسعد بولس. مسعد بولس هو اللي يتولى العلاقات، الصفقات بين قوى الأمر الواقع في ليبيا. في رأيك هل مسعد بولس فعلا يحظى بشرعية المؤسسات الأمريكية أو على الأقل شرعية إدارة ترامب؟
Well, he's the personal envoy of the president. So yes, I think he comes with the full backing of the president of the United States, with his official capacity and probably his family capacity as well.
المسافة بين إدارة ترامب وبين المؤسسات الأمريكية في السلوك، يعني في السلوك الأمريكي بيعرف. هل هي بعيدة قريبة في رأيك؟
Well, I think that the same problems that we saw in the first administration, where there was really no kind of decision-making process, are continuing today. And it doesn't help that the Secretary of State has 4 jobs. Okay, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, he's doing, anyways, he's got many, many hats now, and that's probably doesn't help. And the fact that there's just no predictability anymore in American decision making, right? The decisions come out via tweets. There's no, do you see the thing that was sent to the Prime Minister of Norway? That's nuts, right? So this means, yes, that the dependability, the reliability of the decisions comes into question. Will you make a decision today? Will you have the same decision tomorrow, or will you wake up in the middle of the night and he's changed his mind? And this, again, it reminds me of Qaddafi, right? Because it's just everything that this guy says, okay, well, we just have to wait, cross our fingers, hope for the best, because there's no structure now. The structure is gone. The balance between all the different interests and the whole. So yes, it's I think it's been very damaging, and it opens the door to corruption, kleptocracy, the interests of the few versus the interests of the many.
شكرا جزيلا. نحن سعداء بحضورك وبتحملك عناء السفر. شكرا لقبولك الدعوة.
Thank you very much.
وسعداء أيضا بأنك تظهر معنا لأول مرة بعد هذا الغياب على كاس الأحرار. شكرا جزيلا، ونتمنى أن تتكرر الزيارات واللقاء.
شكرا جزيلا لهذه الفرصة. ذهبية.
شكرا.
Thank you.